My notes okay, right? I share screen, so it should be all right. Okay, so in chapter 1, it started introducing you to what is digital forensic. Now, a lot of times we think of forensic, we think of CSI, the show, or some kind of crime investigation show. In the current day, every investigation that you deal with now, right, currently, has some form of digital investigation, right? You have either, so for example, when we're looking at drug trafficking, right, communication channel doesn't just come from telephone call anymore. And even with telephone call, we can actually track that, but it could come through, you know, encrypted text chat, um, or in the form of email, or maybe that they would go to a forum on the dark web and be able to communicate with, you know, clients or distributor, etc. Or in the case where if someone is committing some form of fraud, right, like if they're stealing money from the company, if they're impersonating another person, everything goes digital because that's what we're using. We're using smart devices, we're using computing system, we're using, you know, different form of communication compared to 10, 20 years ago. So currently, everything that you look at has some form of digital forensic when you're dealing with investigation. So the whole point in digital forensic is really to recover and analyze the data from a specific device, whether it's computer, iPad, smartphones. It could be from a storage drive, right, or an SD card, you know, so forth. Okay. Now, in the case where, let's say that somebody is hacking into the company, and the detection system sounds the alarm, right? How can we really identify that? Well, we can take a look at the network traffic, right? What kind of alarm is raised, and looking at what kind of IP is being used to really attacking our network. Could that be coming from another nation like China or North Korea? Or could it be coming from another organization or an individual or a hacking group, right? So the goal is to really identify, right, what's going on, right? Seeing what's going on, identify like the things that we're going to be analyzing, collect the evidence that you need to evaluate, examine the evidence and preserving its integrity, because eventually we have to have some legal obligations to carry through the process, whether if you're working in law enforcement where you would investigate for, you know, the police department on a case, right? Like a murder case, right? Somebody is being hired to murder someone else, right? We want to preserve that so we can use that as part of the court evidence. Possibly you as a forensic investigator will have to testify in court, okay? Now, the second area is we need to find the artifact, and we'll talk about artifact, right? And so that we can analyze and prove or disprove based on the accusation. Okay, so let's say that somebody is filing harassment in the company, right? Then we have to take a look at email. We have to take a look at what is being communicated that's considered harassment. So, you know, looking at how we can prove that it is that individual that's being harassed and properly take the action in human resource to, you know, fix the problem. Okay, so what I'm going to do is also I want you to go ahead and on Canvas, I need you to download Unit 1 in class assignment. I will go through that with you together as I lecture. Okay, so if you don't understand certain questions or certain area, you know, you can ask, and that way we can address it all together. Okay, so for number 1, it asks you to define forensics, digital forensics, and its goal. And based on chapter 1 notes and chapter 1 content, we can say that the digital forensic is a division that involves recovery of data, analyzing data on digital devices or systems. Okay, and it doesn't always have to be a computer, it could be a car, right? So for example, in a murder investigation case, we want to take a look at, you know, whether that car has a GPS record, because, you know, like OnStar or something. Also, devices are synced via Bluetooth onto the car itself. So in such case, we have to take a look at whether, you know, whose device is actually being synced on there, right? Is it the accused individual, etc., or the suspect, right? So in a lot of sense, what we're going to do is we have to preserve the evidence and to be able to utilize the evidence throughout our process. So the goal is to identify, collect, examine or analyze the data while preserving the integrity. Second, as we mentioned, that we have to go through the formal examination analysis, and we have to be able to prove or disprove of someone whether they're committed of the violation. Okay. So if you're looking at the notes, it's the first page, the first paragraph. That's what you would need for number 1. So now what you would see is there are certifications and jobs that are, you know, seeking. There are a company that's seeking forensic examiner or agencies. So the role of the examiner is to make sure that you would be the unbiased third party. So you have to approach every investigation neutral, right? We don't want to pick side. We want to be the third party that would present the findings based on facts, right? Our examination will be based on fact. So you need to have the ethical obligations to find the evidence that will prove that the suspect is innocent. In the criminal investigation, the finding that would allow you to either provide someone the opportunity to have their freedom back, right? In the corporate investigations, the finding can lead to additional criteria as far as it could cost someone, right? Somebody can go to jail for, you know, committing fraud, or they could be sued by the organization. So it depends on case-to-case basis, but we have to approach it from a neutral perspective, okay? Because understand that we would have a huge impact on these individuals and on the business itself. So you have to come in and you have to gather the facts and you have to examine those facts. So the essential skills, right? Because a lot of my students are like, well, I want to do cybersecurity, but I don't really know what area I want to go into. And this could be an area. So if you're curious by nature, right? If you have a desire to ask a lot of questions, this could be it, right? In this particular field, you will have to ask questions. You will have to interview people. You would have to, you know, find the details on who says what, who did what, right, at what time, etc. And you would have to utilize special equipment. So having the technical knowledge is helpful, especially in digital forensic, where you might have to use equipment to look at hard drive, SD card, smartphone. You would have to use software tools, and some software tool can actually give you the certification, you know, to be able to investigate using that tool. And then looking at, you have to examine the facts and the circumstances that's presented to you, right? And make sure that we are accurate, and we want to draw accurate conclusion. Now, we need to maintain chain of custody, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, properly documenting everything. So when someone show up to the crime scene, and let's say that this person has to bring in all the computers back to, the police department evidence room, we can't just go in and take the computer from that, right? There's pictures that got to be taken, there's forms that got to be filled out, right? Signature has to be signed, date, everything is documented before, you start touching the evidence. Just very much like the TV show that you probably have seen before, okay? So we need to know that we have to really understand how the data is created, what is shared, and how is it shared. Is it social media, right? In the case where it's Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, we have to intervene these other companies, so we have to subpoena for their digital records, right, for that particular user, and that could take time. Okay, so how is data saved? Is it on the cloud? Is it in the physical storage disk? Is it on a device? And then to be able to talk to a larger group of people, you have to present this in court, or you have to present this to the executives or the company, or the investigation team or attorneys, right? So in that sense, we have to have some public speaking skill. We have to have the desire to ask questions. We have to make sure that we are analytical and looking at the facts, and we're accurate, right? And we are detail oriented. So forensic requires a lot of those skills, okay? So what we can do is that section, you can add that to 2, or I summarize here. So the ethical obligations in criminal investigations would be that we cannot be biased. We cannot be biased, so we have to be the unbiased third party, because finding that evidence can prove someone's innocence. And also our conclusions would have a great impact on individuals that are involved in that particular investigation. Okay, that would be 2. For 3, so the skills, as I just mentioned, the desire to ask questions, utilizing specialized equipment, and those equipment sometimes could cost a lot, right? It could cost thousands of dollars, $7,000 to hundreds and thousands of dollars for clean lab equipment. You would be required to have training, and we need to critically examine the fact. And you don't have to put it verbatim, right? We can just summarize some of the answers. As long as you understand what those answers mean, that's fine. And we want to preserve evidence, have chain of custody, and be able to present it in criminal or administrative proceedings. Any questions so far? So as I was planning out your course project, I was thinking about, I just want to add this while some of you are writing down your answer. I was thinking about like, staging like a real case where you would, I would give you the location where you would go and find specific storage device like a USB, and it would have something on there, and then you would have to properly have, it documented and so forth. Then you would also have to pull some stuff from the cloud, and then you would have to, evaluate those things. So that will be part of your project for this course. And I would add, you know, files and things onto different areas, and you would have to recover those files, investigate, and write up a report on what you found, right? Is it incriminating or not incriminating? And then you would present it. Okay. Any question? I know some of you have done like, you know, competition where you do capture the flag. Sometimes capture the flag, they have you do forensic similar to this. Okay. So let's get into number 4. The next part, it talks about digital artifacts. So think of artifacts as a way that we can get more details about who is committing the illegal activity, right? Who is the identity? Now, this is challenging in the digital age because people can use any user name, right, as an account. So I can make a fake account and be able to utilize that. How does that tie to me? Is there a way that I can identify an IP address that's gonna relate it, and then you have to contact a service provider? Or is there a way that I can really pinpoint who is this person based on these artifacts? So the artifacts could be web browsing history, right? We can take a look at, you know, what kind of web searches or web pages that this individual visited. Email communications, what's being exchanged, the content of email, who is it sent to and by. Network activities, right? And especially when we're dealing with breach, network activity is essential. But beyond that, right, maybe somebody is committing cyberbullying, and we can take a look at network activities. Where is that IP coming from, right? Does that IP belong to a system that belongs to a certain individual? So that's going to really tell us who is this person and whether they committed the crime or not. So in the next question, for number 4, we ask, what is the purpose of the digital artifacts in computer-based investigation? These are factual events, right? It could be objects or activities that can be used to identify the person conducting the illegal activity. And what do we mean by objects? Objects could be smartphones, computer. Objects could be an item, right? Object could be a car. And then it could be activities that the subject has committed to. So we can look at GPS coordinates at a certain time, whether, you know, to see if that person is in that location. So for example, if somebody is stealing from the company's warehouse, right, and we have to investigate, we can take a look at the coordinates and see if, you know, that car is actually located anywhere near that warehouse at a certain time, right? Or we can look at the surveillance video of, you know, whether that car actually is in the surveillance video footage of that time, okay? And the job is that sometimes you thought that you find a lot of the factual artifact or the artifacts that would lead to the identity, but that can lead to nowhere, right? And you've seen this portrayed in television and movies where investigator thought that they had narrowed down to that suspect, but yet, you know, they're wrong. So we want to build as much evidence as possible to really identify who that individual is. Okay, so for 4, we can put those things down. And in the span of cybercrime can be a vast number of things, but in general, we're gonna identify a few that's gonna be common. Okay, so hacking is it violates Computer Abuse Act. So circumventing a system is a crime, right? It's very much like entering a private property without authorization. And sometimes a person can be in there and that would be breaking the law, and then sometime that person in there that can take something from that area, that part of the network, that's also breaking the law. So that can accumulate, right? So hacking is a cybercrime. Corporate espionage is a crime. Okay. Forgery is a crime. Cyberbullying is a crime. Harassment, very close to cyberbullying, is a crime. Theft, right? So it could be monetary theft, it could be, you know, intellectual property theft, like stealing someone's design, right? Fraud, trafficking, any form of trafficking. Like if we're looking at human trafficking, that's a crime. Drug trafficking, that's a crime, right? And all of these tie back into digital forensic because we see different areas of you know, the activities that could be investigated via digital forensic. So all I need for you to list here is at least 3 or more example. So you can do 3+. So in the notes, you can find out more, right? It gives you a little bit more details like harassment, sending harassment email. It could be sexual harassment or it could just be, you know, harassment in general. So corporate tend to, you know, have the investigator look at this a little bit closely so we can see, you know, what's the content of the email, who is sending the email, the timestamp of the email. Fraudulent and forgery, we talked about that. Now I put a little comment on espionage. So this is corporate espionage is very, it's very common in the sense where they would try to take information from another company and so that way, you know, would have some financial gain. So secret could be secret design, could be a client list, KFC recipe for fried chicken, or it could be something like, you know, virtual reality system engineering, blueprint, etc. Right? So it could be various things. So an organization can pay somebody to really go and trying to gain information, or sometimes pay somebody from the inside to sell that information from internal. Okay. Now, additionally, could be child pornography or illicit image there, and it could vary depending on, you know, when we're looking at like the location and the local regulation, right? How that can differ from one nation to the next, one city, one state, and so forth. Okay, so regulation is important to evaluate, especially when we're in this field. Okay, so we touched on crimes. So for 6, it asks you to select a role in an investigation that you want to pursue. Describe the task and the activity you would be conducting. So I'm going to go over these roles and you can pick any of the ones that you feel that would fit for you, right? Even though maybe right now you're like, oh, I'm just taking the class to see if you know, I like this. But just imagine, let's say that if you are doing this, right, which role would you hold? Okay, so we just want to select there. So first responder is very much like its name, right? You would be the first person to go over the incident, to respond to that incident, whether it's malware, breaching, right? Somebody is getting hacked, right? And you would respond to that. Very much like the first police officer that's going to show up on that crime scene. Okay, so that first technician, that analyst that's going to respond. So you're going to be the first on the scene. You would need to identify the potential victims, whether it's the organization or the user, or it could be an individual. or you would identify suspects, or both. Okay. So what do you need? You need to have the knowledge of what would contain digital evidence. So for example, let's say that you are the first responder to first responder to an identity theft case, right? So you have to think about what kind of devices or what type of system can I investigate that would hold the data that's essential to this case. Okay, so in the identity theft, a lot of time we would utilize some kind of system to access the web, to impersonate someone, to get financial gains, or access some kind of resources. So we have to think about smartphone, laptops, computers, right, tablets, things like that. So you have to have the knowledge of what items that could contain the digital evidence. Then you have to make sure that you control the crime scene, right? Can't just anybody take stuff from the crime scene, because that can destroy your evidence. So what if they destroy the computer that they were using, right? How would you be able to secure that and prevent people from destroying the systems, destroying the videos, surveillance videos, etc., or contaminate the evidence? Okay, so you have to have proper measure, and in this we want to make sure we secure. So when we're looking at system, we want to secure it. I mean, we also need to disconnect it from the network, right? We don't want any additional network traffic that could contaminate our evidence. So we want to disable connection. We want to make sure that we don't change anything in the digital state of that data storage. So you have to take an image of that system and utilize sometimes multiple copy of that, and utilize the copy in order to evaluate. And then you would contact the investigator, right? And you want to go with the W's, 5 W's, and 1 H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how about the incident. Okay, so we have to go down this list of questions. Who did that, right? What is impacted? When did this happen? Where does this occur? Why is it happening, and how? Okay, so we want to provide additional information to the investigator. We want to seize the evidence and turn it over to the investigator. And every time you do that, you have to make sure that you keep record of it. Who did you pass to and when? Okay, so we want to document that chain of custody. So begin of the chain of custody document, and before you turn it over to the investigator. Now, the second person is the investigator. That will be your forensic examiner. Okay, so this person has to respond to the scene after the first responder had established the foundation. Obtain additional information and evidence from the first responder and additional, so you probably have to gain more information after what was given to you by the first responder. Take charge of the scene and direct all the activity. So in this case, like when we're dealing with the breach, right, the first responder is that we want to make sure that we stop the breach from happening. That's the first responder job. Okay, and to find out what, when, why, and who and where. Okay, so incident responder also sometimes they list the job as title as, you know, an incident responder. Then the investigator would step in and further examine, right? How did they get into the network? Okay, what could possibly be, you know, how long were they there? What are they looking at, right? So we would examine further and to be able to build the case. And we want to maintain the control and to continue with the proceeding. The third person is the crime scene technician, right? So this is often referred to as the digital forensic technician. And there are two areas. One is the sworn officer, which usually, that's law enforcement, right? Whether you work for agency or local law enforcement department. And in that case, you would need to have search warrant to further investigate. So that means that we want to seize evidence. We want to make sure that we obtain a search warrant. And we can obtain the search warrant in two areas. One is based on probable cause. Two is based on the consent of the owner. So for example, right, like now what you see is people get pulled over by the police officer, right? And the police officer asks them, can I search your car? And if that person said, yes, you can, because that person owns that car, right? The police officer can search the trunk and look, into. Now, if they have probable cause, if they suspect that the person that's being pulled over was in a crime, whatever, right? Then they also have a reason to obtain a search warrant to search the car. So probable cause is just reasonable standard that, for some reason that they believe that certain items can be searched in a certain location based on, an assumed cause. Okay. So they have to acquire the search warrant by the judge, and the judge just sign that off, and then they would be able to issue the search warrant. Okay. Now the consent, as we talked about, that person, the owner of the property or the object or whatever it is, this person has to give the consent. Now, we come across issues where there's some gray area. So for example, a lot of companies are doing bring your own devices to work. So I buy a laptop, I buy a smartphone, I attach it to the network so I can do my regular job. Or I own the laptop and I own the smartphone. Now, if I'm being accused of a fraudulent case, right, the company can't just search my devices without my consent or a search warrant. Okay. Well, the company usually, the law enforcement cannot search my devices without a search warrant. The company usually they don't require the search warrant. But now if I buy a laptop and I buy a smartphone and I use it for work, and if the company reimburse me for those things, they have every right to look into those devices because now it's company's own. Okay, so that's why what you see is a lot of companies now, if you do bring your own devices to work, right, they would offer to do reimbursement. So eventually they actually own that device, so that way they can evaluate the data content inside those devices. So this talks about the search warrant, how they can apply for it, right? So let's say that I don't give the consent to be searched. Then the law enforcement officer has to obtain the search warrant, and then the judge signs for it, and they will be able to issue that. Okay. Now, in the area of the non-sworn officer, which is like private companies, right, where you would be working in the security team and you doing forensic for the company, or even when you're contracted by the company externally, right, from outside to come in, you don't really have the power to arrest anyone because you're not sworn officer, but yet you can investigate and then forward your investigation to law enforcement if you consider that it's considered a crime or they're breaking the law. Okay, so we have to really again preserve the evidence and make sure that we have chain of custody. So what does that mean? We got to bag and tag everything. Okay, so on the bag, evidence bag, you would have to fill out the information or sometime add the tag, like who actually start the process, who is examining the evidence, who's acquiring the evidence, And when it's transported to secure location, the person who receives that, they also have to complete the details there. Now, in a lot of cases, we want to, and every time we want to make sure that it's in appropriate containers or rooms that's secure, right? Because we don't want to jeopardize the evidence. So here it talks a little bit more about the tag, and now, we can do a lot of the things digitally, so that can also be optimized and centralized in a certain area so everybody can have access to that. Everybody's on the team, the investigation team can also have access to that or request access for it. Okay, so what I want you to do for the next question is to pick a role that you want. Okay, describe the tasks that you and activities you would be doing with that role. Okay, whether you want to be the investigator, the first responder, the technician, right? And all of these individuals, they actually work with legal teams, HR executives, right? So the forensic team is usually part of security team internally, or they can be contracted from the outside, and they would have to work with the executives and human resource and also the legal department for the company to, coordinate, right, for the case. Okay, so that's for 6. Any questions regarding the role? So one of the areas in forensic, especially for law enforcement, is that we would, you would see that they would deal with child pornography or illicit images, where images are in possessions or being distributed as contraband. So now that can be in the form of graphic files, right? So the basic level, we have to understand that, yeah, these could be JPEG images or graphic images, and that's how it's distributed. Could be pictures, sometimes video. Anyone can be a suspect because these are shared files over the internet and people can use false user account. So in a case where if you have a forum and these people are sharing files inside this forum, right, we would say that anyone in that group could be suspects, or all of them. So what we want is we want to look at the type of regulations against illicit image. So now that could be varied from one part of the world to the next, right? So if you're looking at some part of Asia, is this illegal? Is it not illegal compared to Europe? What part of Europe or United States, right? So that can go back to how the regulation is viewed or applied, right? Enforced in specific area. So on the next question, it says, in the United States, what would be considered an illegal implicit image? So any images that contain erotic, lascivious, or chivious, abnormal, unhealthy, degrading, shameful, morbid interest in nudity, sex, excretion, minor obscenity, harmful materials involving minor. Okay, and I pulled this from the documentation from the Department of Justice. So this is part of the United States. So now, we can really dive into what's considered erotic, right? What's considered abnormal, what is normal, what's abnormal, and all of that can be arguable in court. What's healthy, what's unhealthy. Now, in the case of minor obscenity, you know that, child pornography is illegal here, right? And then in some cases that they would argue what's considered a child, what's not considered a child, and so forth. So, you know, a lot of the areas attorney will take it apart. So in some cases, when we take a look at the law, we have to take a look at what is defined in that law, and then how it's going to be applied to each individual case. Okay. And I put a link on the note. So if you wanted to kind of check out the link, you can read further if you wish. Okay. So now, you know, if you're looking at Europe, right, there's also a link where it talks about how what kind of content would be considered illegal content for online platforms, like on websites, on, you know, different part of online. So Europe is a little bit different. I tried to look for things that are in like a general regulation for Asia, but it's really hard without getting into specific country. So, you know, then you have to really look at like what part of the country, and, you know, so in a sense where we, you know, it's a little bit easier to find like for North America, like United States, Canada, and so forth, and Europe compared to other parts of the world. Okay. Then when we look into email communications, now email address doesn't necessarily mean that that's the user, right? It could be someone sitting at that computer using somebody else's email account, and they could argue that, right? So we have to get service provider involved. And a lot of the service provider, they would say that they don't keep private information from the user, so that way the user would be anonymous to them, and that, you know, in that sense we have to track further. Okay, we have to look further and look for additional information. And so if they don't save any transaction information, IP addresses, connection times, etc., or binding information, then we won't be able to subpoena for that information to use in court. Now, if the service provider, they're able to do that, a lot of times, like your main service provider, even for mobile platform like Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, they're required to maintain your text messages, everything that you sent, for 3 years. Okay, sometime longer. But they try not to keep it for a long time because that will be a vast amount of data that they have to maintain over time. Now in hospital, like HIPAA, right, that's actually required longer. So you have to keep the patient's record for longer than what you would see in your general service provider for communication. So now it says here that if it's located outside of the jurisdiction for the investigation, they can ignore the paperwork when you're requesting it. So if it's outside of that, they don't have to. So if that person is using a service provider outside of that area, then they don't have to provide you with the details. So for example, if they're using VPN, right, and that service provider VPN is outside of the jurisdiction, they can totally delete your request and not respond, and they're not obligated to. Okay, so that can create issues. The author talks about Newsgroup and Usenet, which is a little bit dated, but you do see this now in you know, discussion thread forum online, also on social media. So sometimes in some cases we can pull billing records, we can pull transactional data, we can actually take a look at the content, and or request for those content. Peer-to-peer file sharing give you some records of who's receiving what file, right? Because using that service. Now, a lot of the peer-to-peer server, you have to know that, you know, a lot of them are not in the United States, right? They could be in Europe, Africa, Asia, everywhere. So in some senses, it would be a little bit harder to obtain their data based on requests. Okay, and it talks about harassment here with cyberstalking and cyberbullying, with jurisdiction with that, and also could be varied by state. So now they said that the best place to start is to start with an interview, meaning that we want to conduct some kind of interview. You can ask for permission to record during the interview, right? And so that way you can obtain statements from these individuals. So for the next question, it says, a harassment case has been filed at the local police department. A, how would an investigator begin this investigation? So we want to conduct interview with victim, family members, and affiliates. And harassment could be in the form of email harassment, social media harassment, right? Or somebody can stalk someone in online or even physically, right? And in physical, we can do forensic investigation that we can look at, you know, surveillance video. We can look at, you know, some form of communication. Was there text messages sent to get this person attention, etc. Okay, so what kind of artifacts should you be gathering in such case? We can subpoena for service provider data, text messages, social media data, images, video, posts, network traffic records like IP addresses and services that's utilized with that IP address, right? We can request, if we find probable cause, we can request and issue search warrant if that's, you know, from a law enforcement side, or in the case of private entity, right? If the company's own device, we can, you know, actually obtain the device and be able to investigate. But in both cases, we can obtain consent to be searching. So we can search victim, potential suspect devices and systems. So what would these artifacts help in identifying, right? Really, we are going to identify who the suspect is. So identity, or we can say form identity of the suspect or the harasser, right? Who this person really is, right? If you're looking at image and picture, does that validate that person, right? Like video records of this person committing the harassment. Okay, any question with 8? We got a little bit more to go and then we're gonna wrap up. I know that this is a lot of the newer concept, but you know, you've probably seen shows and TV, so you kind of have a general idea, but now you're gonna be doing it. So there's additional information here as we covered in question 8, right? Ask questions, get general statements, getting your subpoena for subscriber information. So it goes into more details here, get access to the account or account access information, IP addresses. So the logs for the access. So in cybersecurity, a lot of the time we really look at what is being accessed and who accessed what at what time, right? So when we look at the logs, we can really kind of narrow down on who this entity is and what kind of system this person's using. right? Whether they're using a desktop, a smartphone, some kind of IoT device. Okay. On the next part, we're going to talk about criminal conspiracy. So conspiracy occurs when two or more people agree to commit an illegal act. So for example, right, in some cases of murder, right, the spouse is conspiring with, another individual, could be boyfriend or girlfriend, to commit the murder against another spouse. Okay. So conspiring just means that they agreed together to commit the illegal act, whether one person pay the other person or not paying, but just, set them up, or staging for this person, the other person, to commit the crime. So now conspiracy could be with companies, corporate conspiracy, right? So what they're saying in the text is that the potential sources that you need to take a look at for digital evidence and conspiracy could be a vast number of things, including IoT. Okay, so for example, home assistant program, right? Like Siri, Alexa, right? Even search engine and search result and history, right? In a lot of cases, they would say, somebody would search for how to kill someone with with a type of weapon or whatnot. Also look into, or Siri and Alexa, maybe this person is looking for data there. Smartwatches, home security systems give you a lot of like surveillance logs. GPS devices, where the car is or where that vehicle is going to be, or the device, even like smartphones, because that's tied to maps and GPS. And then if we can also dive into the apps, right? Because most of these devices would have apps. And so that way we can look at the intent of somebody committing that crime. Okay. Also social media. Okay, social media, communication media, social media. So in the next question asks us, provide an example for criminal conspiracy. So I just plainly use the one that I just mentioned. A spouse conspire with boyfriend or girlfriend to commit a crime against another spouse. Right? What are the resources or the sources of digital evidence in the case? Well, we can look at IoT app services, social media, email, mobile or phone services, vehicles, GPS services for the device or vehicle. As I talked about before, they might sync their smartphone to the car, so that way we would see what device was connected and we can look further into that device, right? So that's just artifacts or breadcrumbs for us to kind of lead us into further details. And then what type of artifacts should be determined? We mentioned that text messages, emails, social media posts, surveillance videos, communication traffic, vehicle sync data, GPS data. Okay, any question with 9? Okay. So you don't have to use this example. You can come up with your own example, right? And there are different type of conspiracy cases.
Is colluding with Russia a conspiracy case?
I'm sorry?
Is colluding with Russia a conspiracy case as well?
Yeah, politically, sure. But then we have, if you investigating that, where would you look, right? Are you talking about President Trump?
Yeah.
Like tweets, could be conversations, interviews, things that we want to dive into. So his personal devices, his personal systems, it could be government related systems, but people are smarter than that. They use secure phone, right? They use systems that and encrypted form of communication. So it gets a little bit more challenging if the FBI was to investigate it. And there's the so-called politics that's involved, meaning that who is supporting certain type of actions, who's covering for who. So that kind of spread out to, we don't only investigate one person, but we ended up investigating a group of people and many devices and different form of communication, different service providers. So it's kind of like spider web out to many different things.
So so pretty much the whole Robert Mueller investigation was pretty much cyber
Yes,
forensics.
yes. In a lot of in like you see 90% of the cases now, or even higher than that, 95% of the cases have some kind of forensic investigation, especially when it comes with political impact.
Okay, good to know.
Yep. This is a high demanding job, but it requires a lot of effort. So keep in mind that cybersecurity is either way. If you become an ethical hacker, you're investigating different part of the infrastructure, and then you do forensic, you're investigating digital evidence. So it's sometimes you thought that you got to 10 step ahead, you back to square one again. So you have to have patience, and it takes time. Okay. um okay, so let's talk about corporate duties. So in corporate investigation, I previewed this before, but we don't need a search warrant. It might not be necessary in some cases when law enforcement is intervening, or FBI is involved, then they would issue the search warrant. However, when you're investigating within the company, like if you work for that company, you don't have to utilize the search warrant. You cannot seize, and analyze the private property. Um, so you have to know that there is an expectation of privacy, and in the state of California, New York, and a few other states, this is an essential critical area. So you have to really evaluate how the law would play into this, and also the company policy and regulation. Um, so they are expected to have some form of privacy. Now, if the person is utilizing the company's equipment, right, um, they would have limited expectation of the privacy and the data. Okay, meaning that the company does have the right to go in and access the data and evaluate the data, but there is some expected privacy. So consider that. Does a company completely own the data? Not necessarily. Okay, so it's arguably. But if they own the device, they do have, because you know they have, that is a physical property that the company issues to the user. Now the user, if they decide to utilize it for personal purposes and so forth, right, that becomes a gray area, because now they're using their personal account, but on company's traffic and so forth. So depending on the local jurisdiction, you have to take a look at how the regulation is evaluated like that in for that area. So similar to the law enforcement, we would have to get the artifacts, get the evidence, look at the evidence, and then present your finding. And in some cases, we would bring that to law enforcement, and then also for legal cases and judicial proceeding. Now, if the digital forensic examiner cannot authenticate the evidence, then they cannot utilize that in court. This becomes a little bit hairy too in the case where if you have, let's say, a system that's being shared across multiple users. So let's say that it's a shipping warehouse and you have different people from different shifts logging in. We can evaluate the account, right, that would tie to that investigation, but we cannot look into the data for all the other account on that system. And the same goes for home use computers. So if you have a computer at home and it's being shared across, let's say 4 people in the family, right? And if you create a user account for every single person, and if one person is, suspected of a crime, they can take that computer in for investigation, but you are expected to have privacy as other accounts on that particular system, so they cannot evaluate your data on that. So if anything that's incriminating to you and your data, then they cannot utilize that unless they have probable cause and issue the search warrant to get all the account information, all the other account information. So in a sense where, in some area we have to take a look at what is the barrier and what kind of barrier do we face. Is it individual account? When you pull everything from the hard drive, it does not pertain to only that particular suspect, but it could tie to other people as well. So, so importantly, right, the evidence that you're obtaining and you maintaining the chain of custody, you have to take a look at, who, what, why, how, where, and how that will tie to the case. Okay. So in the next question, so what are the duties with the corporate digital investigator? First, we acquire the evidence, analyze the evidence, and present the finding, right? Whether to corporate executives, to HR, to legal team, or to law enforcement, and then take legal proceedings, right? So their attorney will, whether they decide whether to pursue or not. So you have to really consult with them and see if they wanted to bring that forth to law enforcement or not. It's not your choice. So when you find something from the evidence, you have to present that to the attorney, to their legal team and their executives, and then they decide whether they wanted to take legal action or not. Okay. So in the second bullet, I put present their findings to administrative proceeding, right? Or then they may forward it to law enforcement and judicial proceeding. The digital forensic investigator in corporate will not be investigating crime such as murder crime, right? But usually related to fraud, forgery, violation of company's policy, sexual harassment, things like that. Okay, so in the case of there's if someone is hurt or killed, then that will be in the area of law enforcement. So as I just talked about this, right, for 11 it says, when handling an employee misconduct case, how would you, the investigator, determine if the case needs to be reported to law enforcement or not, right? So if the case involves activity that's violating regulations, right, the investigator must consult legal team and executives. It could be varied upon the local jurisdiction. So even if, you know, that breaks the law, right, you have to consult with the legal team or the executives, and then they decide whether we would contact law enforcement or not. So in some cases, they might not even pursue it, right? Any question regarding these two, 11 and 10? And right after class, my cloud video should be available. So once it's available, I will pop that into the Canvas module for Unit 1. So in case if you miss anything, you can always go back, or if you have question at the end of class, we should have extra time. We're about to wrap up the last part, and then I'll talk a little bit about your labs for this week. Okay. So before we get into corporate espionage, right, we want to talk a little bit about policy and procedure. I added some of this part because I don't think a lot of people really understand or differentiate these two well. So when we say violation of policies, what does that mean? It means that there's an action that's committed that breaks the company's rule, okay? And company's rule could be like simple as, you know, not abiding by dress code, right? You show up to work wearing short and t-shirt where they ask you to wear shirt and tie. Or it could be that they ask for the employee not to, you know, use, you know, explicit website at work and someone is watching pornography at work. Or it could be that, you know, not use peer-to-peer file sharing on their computer and someone is doing that. So policies really consist of rules of what is acceptable or unacceptable to the organization. So it needs to be easy to understand. The organization must inform the employee of what would be the consequences when they break these rules, whether they're getting terminated, get written up, you know, getting pay deduction, whatever it is, it needs to be specified in the policy documentation. The organization cannot implement the policy that violate the law, okay? So, and also for the best interest of their employee, they don't want to implement any policy that would violate the law. And they must enforce the policy to make sure that, you know, everybody's abide by the rule. And anything, it says that there must be a documentation of that the employee knew and understood. So usually people sign the agreement that they review the employee handbook, right, which contain the policy right when they get hired, right, and they signed it. So in the case where if they get fired because they violated, they already acknowledged that at the beginning, that they understood those rules, right? And so when we're investigating corporate misconduct, a lot of the times it's violation of the policy, right? So it's simply things like, you know, illegal downloading or taking company data and putting it on, you know, external devices to leave work and selling it, things like that. Now, procedures are just the step of practice. So these are the steps on how to achieve the objective of the policy, right? How to be able to carry out the practice to meet the requirement, the rules, to, for, you know, operate within the rule guidelines, okay? So Here it talks about what would be legal and illegal. So you would consult the executives to decide whether the activities is incriminating, and someone needs to be contacted, or law enforcement needs to be contacted. You need to treat every investigation as if it will go to court. So make sure that your evidence will stand in court, even if it doesn't go to court. And because your evidence will be scrutinized by both sides, whether prosecutor or defense side, they would be able to take a look at the evidence. And so if it's not going to withstand in court, you really don't have a viable case. Okay. Now, before you investigate, don't start looking at other people's file and stuff because you have the title, right? Even if that's your position, in order to conduct investigation, you have to have approval, and make sure this is important. I tell my students all the time, even in ethical hacking, before you investigate, which is kind of ethical hacking is that you investigate and then you write up a report. You have to have written consent or permission. Otherwise, people can argue otherwise, right? They can say, no, I did not give you the permission to start looking into so and so, right? So make sure that the before you conduct any investigation, you have to have authorization for proceeding. Let's see. So it talks about the property, and then working with human resources and legal team to really look at, the employee's conduct, right? Records, files, etc. Okay. Next part is corporate espionage. So if an organization is spying on another to achieve some kind of gain, commercial or financial gain, then that's considered corporate espionage. Nation states that's used that utilize corporate actors against each other, definitely that. So in the case where if you're looking at like government, with another government, right? We know that China had taken the design from Boeing and now create another plane that's equivalent or better than what we have at Boeing. That's considered illegal, but they have to do investigation on how this information was leaked, right? Did they buy the people from inside? A lot of the times they would buy the people from the inside, and that's harder to detect, right? Because you have these engineers and scientists that have been working for the company for years. Not even the new ones, right? They've been there for 10, 20 years, and then they were bought by another entity and be able to actually leak the information. Now, also physical and digital trespassing to gain access of data, right? Physical meaning that you physically go to the room and, maybe put a USB in, take the data, or digital trespassing is trying to circumvent the network, hack into a certain network and be able to, so when you do your discussion this week, right, think about Anonymous. So they committed an illegal act by hacking into Cloudflare and start examining ISIS data, right? Is that fair, right? Or is it not fair? Is it that should we not protect ISIS data if we're Cloudflare, right? Does client really matter? So from a neutral standpoint, what do you see, right? Which is unethical, which is not. Now, corporate could be impersonating someone, right? They would send someone that pretend to be a janitor or an executive or an IT person to be able to physically gain access to the server room, right? To, steal data or just physically take that down, right? Disable the server so that way they can have some kind of commercial gain or financial gain. Intercepting, so eavesdropping on voice or data communication, or defacing someone's website, or doing man in the middle and intercepting some of the data from that particular website, manipulating social media against a competitor, right? Changing some social media posts, etc. So that could be a set of different things that we would deal with in corporate espionage. So now you can just pick a few of those and you can list those for number 12. So I described spying on others. Nation state use each other to utilize corporate actors against each other, right? And if you watch the movie by Edward Snowden, you would see some of this, or there are tons of different movies out there that talk about this. And then physical or digital trespassing and gain access. So someone can, cut fiber optics across the United States and disable some of the larger communication, right? And or just to eavesdrop on someone's data. So you can take pieces of that section and put it in for number 12. And we're coming down to like the last 10 minutes, I know. So I just have a few more to go. So as you watch the video for your discussion, you should also think about access control. And security is about that. It's about physical and digital security, right? Or we call it logical security sometimes. Physical meaning that we would look at how we physically secure certain area, lock doors, file cabinets, or even file folders on our network shared drive. Who has access to what, right? Network access, system access. Access control is about protecting asset. Data is asset, people is asset. And if you're controlling what the users are accessing, right, at a more critical level, what you're doing is you should also preventing unauthorized user from accessing. Okay. So as an investigator, what you need to do is look at the logs. And investigator is more of like the reactor, right? The person that comes after what happened. Okay. So they need to take a look at the logs, look at the user identity, what is being accessed, right? If they enter the server room, was there some kind of, security card swipe, right? Which card was used, what time they use it, right? How long were they in there? Okay. And while they're in there, what did they access? So we can look at surveillance recording, what is being compromised, right? Look at, if you're dealing with anti-malware, look at anti-malware logs. Look at routers, firewalls, switches, okay? Authentication server for digital attack, especially when you're dealing with like hack. Now, it says that while detective control allows you to investigate what occurred, it doesn't prevent from an incident occurring again. So this is not a deterrent, it's very reactive, okay? So in the next question, it says, why is access control important in corporate digital investigation? Our goal in security is to protect assets, okay? And access control, it entails the area of protection, which can be evaluated in investigations such as logs, traffic, network appliances, processes, applications, system logs, services, devices, connection, authentication, permissions, and status. So when we look at that, we have a big list of what we could be evaluating, right? In the case where someone is entering the network, an unauthorized entity is entering the network. And if you took security classes before, you're familiar with some of the terms, but we can go over some of the basic definition of the terms. Okay. So for 14, it asks you, it says, Tammy is contracted with ABC Corp to breach the network, evaluate network weaknesses, and provide recommendations to improve the company network security. What type of hacker is Tammy? And that will be white hat. Okay. Why is it white hat? Because, sorry, let me pull down the document. The type of hackers are listed here. So hacker in general is a user that's gaining access to information system that belongs to another. And I kind of wanted to not use the word malicious when I said that, because there are different types of hacker. There's white hat hacker, right? So these people are positive actor, meaning that their goal is to identify weakness of the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses of the organization and help the organization improve. Okay, it could be internal or external, like Tammy. So Tammy in question 14 is a white hat hacker. The black hat hacker would have malicious intent. This person would violate and exploit, like Anonymous. Okay, but Anonymous is actually hacktivist. They do it for political reasons. Okay, so they are a set of black hat that do it for a cause, which makes them hacktivists. They do it, they exploit for political reasons. Now the script kiddies are the ones that use pre-made tools to launch attacks. And most of the time they don't have extensive knowledge in what that attack can do. And that would be very dangerous, because it's kind of like someone is just doing it because they can. They don't know the consequences of what could happen, right? And then the last part is it goes over social engineering. And when you read the textbook, it's interesting because he talks a little bit about goldfish and phishing. So some of the tools that are used is goldfish to fish out, username and password, right? But our goal is not to use those tools. Our goal is to understand those tools and how those tools can be used to commit crime, okay, or violate the policy of the company. So if somebody is trying to phish other people's username and password and use it for impersonation, right, we know that those tools can be utilized. So goldfish is used for capture name and username and password. Another one is open source intelligent techniques that would capture organization email. There are other tools, and if you use Kali Linux, you've seen a set of them for impersonation. Okay, and then the lastly is the insider threat, and we know that these are harder to detect. They can cause a lot of damage. Okay, it could be employees, or it could be employees that are a bot. So you have to get into the mindset of who this individual is, right? Are they an opportunist? Are they looking for some kind of gain, fame, money? A lot of time, it ties back to monetary gain or some kind of recognition gain. Are they a disgruntled employee? Are they out for revenge? Are they upset because they didn't get a raise? Right? What kind of individual are you dealing with? Could they be attackers? So we kind of had to build this profile for this individual based on the artifacts that we have. Okay. And we would identify the threat by talking to HR, by interviewing affiliates and coworkers, by looking at employees' records and information and permissions. So you would look at issued laptops, tablets, mobile devices, cloud accounts. That's where you would start. Okay. Now, if they terminate or resign, you also have to look at the data prior to the termination or resignation, months or years before. So that could go back to years and years of investigation. Okay. Because sometimes they got what they want and then they leave. Then we have to know, you know, how did they really get there and how long did it take and what did they use? Who did they talk to? What kind of access they have? So many different things. So we started to have to answer all those questions as we investigate. Okay, USB devices, cloud account, shared files, traffic, etc. Okay, all right. So I'm right at